Welcome back to our discussions with Professor Prabhat Patnaik on the global financial crisis. Prabhat, you have talked about the bubble phenomena. Now, what constitutes in that sense a bubble? Is it always speculation, or there could be real developments of productive forces in terms of technological innovation, which I believe happened in the 19th and the 20th century? So do you think the speculative bubbles are different from technology innovation bubbles?
Yes, certainly. I think the speculative bubbles are actually superimposed on the innovative bubbles and so on. You see, innovative bubbles, or if you call them bubbles, but innovative cycles is something that people like Schumpeter were talking about as characterizing capitalism, and that of course happens. But the moment you have financial asset markets, whether you like it or not, on any such innovative phenomenon, you are going to have speculative bubbles. Because when you find asset prices rising, I mean, fundamentally the market cannot distinguish between enterprise and speculation. The moment you find asset prices rising, some people would expect, even those who expect that in the long run the asset prices are going to come back to their original level, would expect that for a while this increase is going to continue, so they are going to buy assets. When they buy assets, the price rises further. That gives rise to a further expectation of a rise, and so the bubble gets built up. So it would be impossible to avoid the building up of bubbles in a capitalist economy with financial asset markets, and financial assets are important because the carrying costs are very low. I mean, you can't, speculative hoarding of commodities costs something because there's a carrying cost, but speculative behavior on the stock market or any of the financial asset markets costs you nothing, just a few telephone calls perhaps. So as a result, you find that invariably there are speculative bubbles superimposed on real movements, even when the real movements themselves are also cyclical, like innovations.
One could argue that the financial markets have always earlier ridden on top of a basic expansion of capital, either colonial expansion, the South Sea bubble long back, and so on, the gold mines which used to be floated spuriously on the stock market, and so on. But they were also coupled with real innovations that came out in technology, therefore new technology companies. All the major names you have came really out of technological innovation, General Electric, telephone companies, and so on. But what it distinguishes the current bubble really was that it was on housing. Now that is one thing, certainly is not innovation. You could argue the dot-com bubble at least had the pretension of being a technology-driven bubble, which it was not. But there really wasn't anything in that sense except a speculative bubble in this case.
But of course the housing bubble was actually engineered by Alan Greenspan, you see, because when he found the dot-com bubble collapsing, he was a person who actually believed that the US economy would then get into a recession, so he lowered interest rates, and there's always a close relationship between the level of interest rates and the housing market. So in a certain sense, the fact the housing bubble happened is something which is itself a result of state policy, Alan Greenspan's policy. But now everybody is pillaring him. But the fact of the matter is that suppose that had not happened, then of course the boom wouldn't have been pronounced. In fact, the US would have gone into a recession much earlier, at the end of the dot-com bubble. So the ironical fact is that the more prolonged the speculative bubble is, the greater is likely to be the crash. In fact, the derivatives are basically a way of prolonging the speculative bubble, and which is why they also contribute to the crash when it comes being sharper.
Well, it appears now that the financial sector of the US seems to have got out of the temporary crisis, while the job market, the manufacturing, is still very much in the doldrums. It's also interesting that, as you said, the centers of capitalism are harder hit this time,
Yes.
and the periphery, of course, in
Yes.
global population terms, they're really not the periphery, they are the center. The periphery has been hit relatively much less. And in fact, Brazil, China, India, all of them seem to have not suffered the consequences much as the US has. Do you think that this presages a new movement in the nature of global capital, that actually the periphery will strengthen on this count?
You know, I really think that this crisis is going to be far more prolonged. And I also feel that there may be a change in the nature of the crisis. I really think the crisis is not only a Keynesian one. It's not only the collapse of the bubble. I think there are many more things happening. I certainly believe that if you have a recovery now, there are no signs yet of a recovery, but I certainly believe that if you have a recovery now, then that recovery would give rise to an increase in fuel prices and food prices of the sort we had in 2008, that also
prices
would be fed by speculation. So that I think the importance of speculative finance capital is so great in contemporary capitalism, which again combined with the fact that, you know, per capita cereal output in the world economy is declining steadily from the middle of the 1980s. So that, you know, there are limits which have been reached. I don't mean natural Malthusian limits, but limits which have been reached within contemporary capitalism in a number of ways to the expansion of commodities production and so on. And on top of that, you have the superimposition of speculative finance capital. So if we get out of the Keynesian crisis, then we might be getting into an inflationary crisis of a fairly severe order of magnitude. So I really believe that the crisis is not going to be overcome so easily within contemporary capitalism. In fact, you know, I mean, one might actually be a bit hyperbolic and talk about it having entered a period of permanent crisis, which is not to say that it is collapsing or any such thing, but it will require substantial restructuring.
Do you think this restructuring, the fact the Chinese today are looking more at stimulating the domestic economy, domestic consumption, all this would actually help in some sense the global economy to come out of its crisis?
If China was a large enough country, then that certainly would have. By the way, you know, this famous Polish Marxist economist Oskar Lange had a theory that the reason for the stability of post-war capitalism, which everybody attributed to Keynesian demand management, which of course was true also a certain extent because of his coupling with the Soviet Union, which is a very stable economy. I mean, whether it's true or not, I mean, it's an interesting idea. But I think China, to the extent that it actually does, on the basis of domestic stimuli, maintain a high level of activity and growth, would have that effect on the world economy. But I think even now it is not a large enough player for that effect alone to make a substantial difference.
But do you think with countries like Brazil, India and others putting it into that pool, that would sort of help to stabilize the global economy, but change the relation between the quote-unquote center and periphery?
You see, China has a number of advantages which countries like India do not have. I certainly would not put India and China in the same bracket. I mean, certainly in the case of China, for instance, its exposure to globalization, to globalized financial flows is much less than in the case of India. That being the case, the limits on state action are much greater in the case of India than in the case of China. I mean, you can see the Indian government is so keen to stimulate the stock market, while the Chinese government has announced a fiscal package which is so large that if actually the stock market was left to behave the way stock markets normally do, there would have been a collapse of the Chinese stock market. So the Chinese government has a lot more of freedom to act against the wishes of international finance capital than the Indian government has.
Thank you, Prabhat. We'll come back in the next section to a discussion on the Indian economy.